Cool. I think we're on. So, welcome, Otis. Welcome, Open Mic Eagle. Thank you for joining us. This is the next event for Otis's Artist in Residency. Just to provide some context, Otis has been working with the University of Sheffield over the last few months to organize a program of critical and creative activity for students, but also people within the city of Sheffield, to think about the ways in which hip hop can productively engage with academia, to look to dismantle systems of marginalization and oppression, but also beyond that, to look at how hip hop can expand our notion of what the arts humanities can do, both on an aesthetic, but also on a social and political level. We've had to move things to the online domain, and last week was the first event of doing that, which revolved around the theme of metamorphosis. Today, we're going to be looking at rap poetics and art rap in conjunction with that, talking about the ways in which language plays such an important role in hip hop, but also in terms of determining the societal structures that we live in. But before we get into that conversation, I think it'd be good if Otis and then Open Mic could just introduce yourselves, give us a bit of a sense of your work, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. So, as you know, my name is Otis Mensah. I'm a hip hop artist, a spoken word poet laureate of Sheffield. Yeah, and I guess mainly my work is focusing around the concept of vulnerability, and I'm using that as a centerpiece for my work, as a sort of launch pad for my work. And I'm specifically interested in how hip hop as a culture has taught me what I like to call poetic vulnerability, and has taught me how to sort of harness language, I guess, for my own therapy and catharsis, you know? Yeah. So yeah, I'm blessed to be here. It's super hyped to be talking to you and Open Mic tonight. So yeah, thank you.
That's so dope. I guess I mean, I've heard your music a lot, and I know that it's great. I wasn't necessarily aware that that's what was informing it, and that's really dope. Like that vulnerability piece is something that I feel is so sorely lacking in hip hop, and it's important because so many of the people who perform hip hop, they have a need to feel that sort of vulnerability,
Yeah.
to access things that are buried underneath. So that's just a really dope mission. My name is Open Mic Eagle. I'm a rapper from the United States, born and raised in Chicago. I live in LA. I've put out like 6 albums. I've done stuff in the comedy world, on television, podcasting, some writing, just all the creative endeavors that I can be a part of. I try to be. And thanks for having me here on to talk through with you guys today.
No, thank you so much for joining us. I can already tell it's going to be a really interesting conversation. So thank you. Just to kick things off, this is going to be a very informal format. We're just going to have a discussion and just explore some ideas between one another, revolving around this rap poetics, art rap idea. But as an initial question to get things going, I'm just curious if both of you could give us a bit more context as to why you first developed these concepts. So Otis, for you, currently you're using this Rap Poetics label to encapsulate your hip hop music, your art. And I'm interested to know a bit more about that. And Open Mic, similarly, I know that the art rap concept came quite a while ago now. So I'm curious to know what your thinking was at the time for that, and perhaps how it's maybe changed over time. And if you still kind of, the mission that maybe drove it then is still the same to you now, or maybe your thinking's changed. And then a broader, I suppose, discussion to come after that is, what is the impact of language? These seems like they're very conscious moves to manipulate language in such a way as to have a material impact. That's what it seems to me. And so I'm just curious to know, what is the role of language in shaping, I guess, social structures, and how can language be used to maybe engage and dismantle those structures that are oppressive? So I guess there's a series of questions there. So just starting off, the concept of rap poetics, Otis.
Yeah, sure. So I guess in many ways, I never thought of the concept rap poetics. I never once thought when when I was starting writing and sort of being inspired by hip hop as a culture, I never once thought, what I'm doing is rap poetics. I was sort of just inspired by hip hop, touching on what you were saying, open mic, is about vulnerability. It's like I was actually inspired by. I guess maybe vulnerability, maybe a better term to describe the vulnerability that I felt was like emotional intensity. I was really inspired by the emotional intensity that was coming from certain rappers, and it was sort of an honesty that I hadn't experienced in other cultures. It's like being from the UK, growing up when I did, being in school when I did. It just so happened that when I was searching for an expressionistic outlet, the one that I found was grime, or was under the umbrella of grime and the whole culture that's around that. And for me, that's very exciting, not just because it felt so youthful and because it was so expressive and was a place to channel my emotion, but it felt exciting because that was from the UK. It felt very much it felt very British, and that's a proud thing. Like that felt very good in the sense that we grow up listening to music from the States and stuff of that nature, and you have a lot of UK artists that may emulate that, or try and assimilate to certain sounds. So when like something that comes from the UK that's I guess unapologetically British, it feels somewhat proud when you're in the culture of like, I guess, pop culture, art culture, So for me, it was really exciting. Obviously, I didn't verbalize that at the tender age of 16, 15, But I think somewhere down the line, for me, it came with a certain level of pretense. It's sort of like I needed this outlet, but the outlet that I found wasn't one necessarily for me personally that was nurturing my feelings of anxiety, perhaps my existential angst that any teenager might be going through, my feelings of depression. So then actually what I did, I guess way more subconsciously than I can ever imagine, was I did a sort of 180 back to my influences as a child. And my dad was a hip hop DJ in the 90s, playing on pirate radio. My mum was a poet. It's like she wrote poetry, she engaged with poetry. Though I'm no young savant, like my parents didn't raise me into this field. I'm sort of working under the impression that these things must have taken their toll on me. So, I found this vulnerability in hip hop. I found it through artists like yourself, through artists like Atmosphere, POS, Aesop Rock. It's like a more experimental, what would be, I guess we're going to get into labels in a sec, but what would be considered a more experimental version of the art of rap from the culture of hip hop. And I found solace in that. And I thought I could, develop my own identity within that. And it became very meaningful for me, very truthful for me. I found the music that I was falling in love with to be extremely poetic, profound, insightful, philosophical. It taught me what I know, as I say this numerous times, it taught me what I know about history, about politics, or at least it sparked my study into those things. So then when I stepped into academia, and I started to see the perception of hip hop, and I started to see that actually they perceived hip hop as something that was trivial, something that was unintelligent. I immediately was, of course, struck with a paradox. And the paradox was like, well, what hip hop are you listening to then? Because actually, it's like I feel that I've just grown from this whole world that I've delved into. So that's when I started to make when I started to realize that not only does that exist, but maybe it plays a bigger role in the narrative of racism, institutional racism, or elitism, classism that exists within the university, that exists within academia, exists within society in general. I started to make a conscious decision to say, actually, no, this is rap poetics. Like, this is just as intellectual as any of your, whitewashed Shakespeare and so on, so on, so on. So it became then a political decision to call the music that, and less natural. It was societal. My reason for that was societal to some extent. Yeah.
Great, thank you. How about you, Open Mind?
Mine, it's funny that you ended up at political, where my reasoning was purely political.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Purely, you said we were going to get into labels. Art rap for me was purely a label,
Mm-hmm.
and a label that I deemed to be, at the time, necessary based on the overarching category of hip hop at that time. So now we're talking about 2008, 2009, when what was going on in the mainstream of hip hop at that time, as high quality, as impactful as it was on the world, I think of artists like who was big at the time, like Waka Flocka Flame was really big at
Mm-hmm.
the time. Gucci Mane was really big at the time. This was, Kanye was still doing his thing, but he seemed like more an alternative to a mainstream that felt more street than ever.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like what I was doing, what I was wanting to do, and the people who I was listening to a lot at the time and really drawing inspiration from, these are people like Serengeti, Shabazz Palaces, early Danny Brown, and this is coming off of the legacy of things like Anacon
Mm-hmm.
and Project Blowed and Rhyme Sayers, which are still very active, and Def Jux, and all of these movements across the country that were celebrating a more personal and a more inventive, from my perspective, kind of hip hop. And really, it was the personal approach that was important to me. I felt like I needed a label so that anybody who saw what I was doing would not expect me to be echoing what was happening in the mainstream. And I used to think about that all the time. And one day I was thinking about it, and it occurred to me that um, within rock music, there's all of these sub labels. Like you have rock as a header, and then under that you can have punk, you can have grunge, you could have rockabilly, um, and then there's an actual genre that's been existing for decades called art rock. And if listen to art rock, you expect to hear something that's a little more thoughtful, that's a little more personal. And so to me, I felt like rap needed that. It needed a space that was designated for people to bring that sort of aesthetic, that sort of feeling, that sort of reflection, that sort of the sound that comes when one is motivated by their own personal artistic values, where like that is the most important thing. So art rap didn't need to all sound alike. It could be different approaches taken within it. The
Mm-hmm.
important thing was that it was informed by the values and the life experiences of the individual, rather than trying to fit what you are doing as a performer, as an artist, into what's expected based on what's happening in the mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
So at that time, I felt like it was really important to have that designation. Like I said, this is, 2008, 2009, 2010. And it was a reactive term. It was reactive to what was going on in the mainstream. So if you fast forward to now, I don't think those conditions are the same
Mm-hmm.
in terms of American hip hop. I think American hip hop now is at the most imaginative place it's ever been. There's room for so many different types of expression in the mainstream now that didn't exist before. I think it's far from ideal. I think that there's still a lot of trend chasing that happens even in the artistry. But if you looked at the variance of images that exist in the mainstream now, if you look at the variance of sound that's acceptable in the mainstream now, it's come a long way. And so now I feel that art rap as a label is less necessary. But I do think a term is still needed. I do
Mm-hmm.
think a label is still needed. And in a lot of ways, I'm still trying to find what that is for me.
That's really interesting, man. Yeah. No, I find that really interesting because I guess in 2020, you're right. So many different styles can sort of exist together, and I guess I guess to some extent the internet has done that, or the internet has sort of curated a sort of environment where it matters less. Sort of the label matters less. However, interestingly, like I find such solace in the term art rap, and I imagine that that I feel about it now, maybe how you felt about, like, how you felt that it was needed then. I feel like I need it for my own personal journey to some extent. So that's really interesting to me that that term that you created in a specific space and time has this huge span in existence. Yeah.
And I can't take credit for creating it. I thought I created it. But then in using it, it came to my attention that other people had used it before. Going back to like Ramel Z, who was one of the one of the earliest New York rappers, who was very much also in the visual art scene at that time in New York. And his stuff was called art rap, even if he didn't call it that. I may have been the first to embrace the term and wave it as a flag, but it did exist before. And I'm happy that it does gravitate. And I'm glad that people do find it useful. I think that what it is for me now, though, is that what I find people need to be more aware of isn't necessarily that I am following my own personal aesthetic as much as I am. What I find that I need to inform people about is the difference in what it means for me to be a professional rapper economically, in contrast to what it means for somebody on a major label to be a professional rapper. I feel like there needs to be a label to help people understand that the stakes are so much different for me. And the way that I have to go about having a career and what informs my songwriting and my place in the world, and the rewards for what I can achieve are just vastly different than what people might think or expect based on paying attention to the mainstream.
It's really interesting that you've brought up that topic, because Otis and I were literally just discussing the precarity of pursuing an arts career, certainly in the UK for an independent artist, like Otis. There isn't a clear sort of, unless you're willing to go and do grime music or what the mainstream is putting forward, there is not a clear and stable path presented to you. And we were just discussing ways in which to go around that, where you don't sacrifice your own personal artistic integrity. With this residency, with our other work, and Otis individually and myself individually, having been engaging a lot with institutional spaces, particularly academia in the UK. And I think going off of the very concept of art rap and the way that I've heard you speak of it on YouTube and stuff, you've engaged with the art world. I mean, at least in a conceptual sense. I remember you describing what an art event would look like and how your music would engage with it. I suppose my thought and my question is what has your experience been of engaging with these more institutional structures, maybe beyond hip hop, I suppose, and maybe a more not more artistic infrastructure, but an artistic infrastructure that is somewhat separate to hip hop? And have you found yourself, with what you're saying about the career trajectory, engaging with those different structures in a particular way to carve out a career for yourself? How has it been engaging your art in these different spaces? So maybe just anything on your experience there.
My experience with that has been wildly varied, because I think that I inhabit a space that is difficult to classify unless someone's willing to dig a bit under the surface. And so what that means is I constantly find myself in situations where people either really get what I'm doing or they just absolutely do not. I find in certain worlds they get it a little more. I find that in the art world, it's hit or miss, because I feel like my experience in the world of art as it pertains to rap is that the art world can be very easily tricked into believing that a rapper is important if they dress that part. I feel like the performance art aspect of it means so much more in that world that it can in a lot of ways overshadow what the person's actually saying or communicating within the message of the music. And so my experiences with that world have been either very validating or very invalidating, depending on what that institution is. I find that universities are often receptive to me, but I think that's based on me having an understanding of how I have to be able to speak about my work in context. And that's a difficult thing to learn how to do, especially when you make rap music that you feel like is very much about your life and your perspective. It's difficult sometimes to look at that work as a finished body and step outside of it to be able to describe how it sits in context to people that aren't in it. It can be but I know that that is something that is important for me to be able to do. And because I'm able to do that, I find that the university world is accessible to me and is receptive to me, because I know how to communicate about what I do in a way that can resonate in that environment. But I find that I've had the most success in the comedy world, and it's not necessarily because I feel like I am a comedian, but there's something about how the comedy world revolves around the stand-up comic, and how the stand-up comic is usually one person who takes the stage and is giving you a show based on their thoughts and their observations around the world, and how that industry is very understanding of that. That has created the conditions where that world understands me more than most. I feel like sometimes that world understands me more than the hip hop world does, because the hip hop world is usually informed by carefully crafted images, that come from well-resourced institutions, and it kind of works backwards from there. Where the comedy world is really about who is stepping on stage at an open mic or at a comedy club and saying things that are resonating with people. Like, the business people in comedy take note of that and advance those people's careers. Comedy audiences listen. And I found that has made them very receptive to me.
Do you think there's somewhat a similarity between how harsh perhaps a comedy audience might be to how harsh, an audience that are listening to hip hop might be? Because I guess to some extent, when you look across certain genres, there's way less of this competitive nature that we do have inherently in hip hop. Do you think that is there in comedy? Because, as you said, the comedian is there, they're bearing their thoughts, they're bearing all their vulnerabilities. And I guess there's a question about authenticity, and to define the word authenticity, being true to yourself, being honest. I guess there's a question of authenticity. I feel in other genres, in other maybe like art forms, there's way more leniency to fabricate. And I know that a lot of fabrication happens in the mainstream of hip hop and rap. I know a lot of fabrication does happen in the marketization of it. However, fabrication of it is something that to be looked down upon. There's always there's always someone picking apart saying, oh, but is that rapper living what they said? And I guess to some extent, that's similar in the comedy world. Like you expect that comedians' experiences to be what they're expressing. You know, do you feel that there's those parallels there? And how does that engage with you and your journey?
I feel like, wow, that's such a great question. The one thing that I feel like is highly valuable in terms of that comedy world that we miss in rap music is the feedback. Comedy audiences are incredible at giving feedback, and whether that's uproaring laughter, whether it's deafening silence, whether it's booing, heckling, whether it's people walking out of a room, people come there prepared to engage with what's on stage and give an honest physical reaction to it.
Yeah.
Where if you think about rap, people are usually either fans of a rapper and they're coming to their show to see them and engage with music they're already familiar with, or they're there for a rapper like that, and then somebody else is opening and they might be open to receiving what this other artist is doing. But you don't get a lot of rap fans that just go to random rap shows of people who they've never heard of. Typically in rap, if you don't like something, you just ignore it.
Yeah.
So it's a different level of feedback. To the question of authenticity, and I haven't figured this out about rap, but the way that it's received is very different than other genres, where, like you say, there's an expectation with rap that who this person is who they say they are. And it's so different from almost any other genre of entertainment, where, like, if you go to a film, you don't expect the character in the movie to be reflective of the actor playing it. Like there's space to inhabit a character, and there's space to inhabit a character in hip hop too, but you have to go through great pains to create that space. Because the default for a listener is to expect that the person on the record or the person on the stage is telling you exactly who they are with every lyric. And it's very different than rock music. It's I guess the closest thing would be like blues or country. Yeah. But even then, there's room to tell more tall tales. And I think there used to be that in hip hop too. If you think about like Too Short, or like early Snoop, like there was a little bit of a tall tale aspect to it. Schoolie D. But the balance of that was somebody like Chuck D, who was coming on and telling you exactly what was going on and exactly what they were seeing, and there was no room for bullshit at all. The hood reporter aspect of it was very big. Yeah. And I feel like somehow that informed the genre going forward in ways that didn't take hold in other genres. And I've never been able to quite figure out why that is.
It's interesting you said the term like hood reporter, because for me, I'm often making this argument when people are talking about poetry and you know, it's like when I became poet laureate, someone wrote an article, I can't remember where it was, but it was in a local newspaper. It's like, we can't believe Otis Mensah has become poet laureate. He's not a poet. A poet is Williams Wordsworth. So it was like, and you always get this sort of this backlash. Sometimes it comes about in a look, or, you know, it's like you slowly start to see the crowd disappear as I'm performing my poetry, something of that nature, you know. But what I always say in these arguments in academic circles is, one, I'm not, I'm not playing the game to a second. When people are asking me, who are your favorite poets? I'm saying Open Mike Eagle, Billy Woods, Aesop Rock. You know, it's like I'm there saying that. But the way I'm also defending that on a philosophical, intellectual level is I'm saying that actually when you look at how poetry has been over intellectualized. I like to call it intellectual masturbation. It's just like beating the same point over and over until you don't get the practical meaning. When you look at how much fabrication goes into poetry and the poetry that we learn in the syllabus, etc., I start to think, when I start to look at the culture of hip hop, start to think about that element of, let's say, like a community reporter, what I like to call a community philosopher, like colloquial philosophy, this idea that the hip hop artist is speaking for the community, they're of the community. You start to see actually that that's more poetry than traditional poetry could ever be, because I guess when you look at the origins of poetry, it's, you know, somewhat of a folk art, and it's coming from, you know, the fact that they was telling stories in the community. I don't know, they were gathered around the fire or something. They were telling their stories, and there was less of an institution. And I guess that the poetry world has spiraled and grown to be something, had a hierarchy injected in it to what it's become now. But if you strip it back, it looks way more like hip hop than the institutional poetry world, you know? So I find that interesting, you know? Do you think that the need for authenticity and honesty in hip hop do you feel it's more beneficial for you as a creative, and how that sort of weighs on your mental health? The fact that, you know, maybe you might think twice about fabricating a certain narrative, or maybe you might, not you as a personal artist, but like as a hip hop artist, you might think, oh, I'm going to be questioned on this. Do you think that comes across for the personal artist journey as a positive thing, as a beneficial thing? Do you think it keeps people in check, or do you think it plays into a narrative of sort of scrutiny? Could we unlearn it a little more, or do we need more of it? Is it good, sort of thing?
I mean, me personally, I don't subscribe to it.
Yeah,
I feel like I have license to say whatever I want on a song, whatever I want. I don't feel like I have to. If I tell a lie on a song, I don't feel like I have to clarify that. But that gets back to what I was saying about the reasons I felt like I needed to have a term like art rap in the first place. Is I wanted a space to be whimsical if I wanted to be whimsical, and my life is not whimsical. It's not that. Like to me, we've done the hood reporter thing for years and years and years and years and years, and some people are really excellent at that and make super highly impactful music from that, and that's awesome. But for me, sometimes that's boring. I know what's going on in the streets. I live in the streets. I know what's going on in the world. I don't necessarily want a news report. I want a rapper to be able to explore their most fanciful thoughts, because to me that's the most interesting thing, is like not necessarily what's right in front of you. Although I do love to write a song about something that's super mundane as well.
Yeah.
But in me saying that, something is starting to occur to me. We talk about the hood reporter thing, but that might be a little bit of a misnomer too, because what's expected in that is not an actual reflection of what's going on in somebody's life. Because the hood reporter thing often yields the exact same subject matter across multiple artists. And sure, they might share some experiences, but what makes the shared ones more valuable than the not shared ones? It's not really reporting. It's only reporting 10 or 15% of what goes on in someone's life. Where I'm more concerned with the real experiences a person has that aren't part of that 10 to 15% that we've heard over and over and over again. I want to hear about a time somebody had to apologize. I want to hear about a time somebody fucked something up, broke something. I want to hear about when it was your fault, and you usually don't get that. So that's why I was really excited to hear about your mission being informed by vulnerability, because I do feel like that's what's missing. Like, you know, we've all listened to Drake songs, and I think Drake makes great songs. I don't think I've ever heard a Drake song where something that was wrong was his fault. And I know that's happened in his life. For sure. I know for sure that's happened. And I want to hear his take on that, with how great of a writer he is. I want to hear that rather than all the times it was somebody else's fault.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Can I just jump in there? Because I have a question about imagination. Because I think that is somewhat there's a synchronicity between imagination and authenticity, because I think what you're saying is that authenticity is being able to talk about all levels of your own experience, and then allowing yourself to imagine. But the way in which it's operationalized is that actually it limits you to this very one-dimensional thing. And I suppose my question is about imagination is in regard, I think, to politics. You know, we're at a time now where, certainly on social media, there's a real call for using imagination to imagine a radical a society, I suppose, that is different to the one that we have now. And imagination seems to play such an important part in terms of significant resistance. So not reform, but actual radical change. Because unless you can imagine an alternative world, then how are you ever going to get there? And I wonder if that chimes with your own sense of politics and how to approach political change, and the role you think of the hip hop artist who is potentially, as you say, being bound to this this role where they have to play authentically. What can hip hop artists do within that sort of field? I suppose, and is actually, if a space is created for a hip hop artist to imagine freely, could that be a really important political move for that particular artist? So I guess it's a question around imagination and politics.
Yeah, I mean, to a large extent, I feel that art is a place to begin, you know, and often that, without providing context, that often sounds like a cop-out. You know, you tell people that no, it begins with the art, and it sounds like you don't understand the political climate, you don't understand the work that needs to be done. I'm by no means skating away from the work that needs to be done in society, but I'm thinking that in a place where I've been most susceptible to change, in a place where I've been most likely to change the internal systems within me, have been when I've been engaging with art. And that's because, back to what you were saying, is because I felt like there was this exchange in emotion. I felt that there was an emotional dialogue happening. I felt that either the artist was being vulnerable, they were engaging with something, a concept or a topic that I related to. There was this point of relation, and it created this sense of community. I, for one, think that perhaps in a society that's largely fragile, in a society that's largely opposed to facing these big problems that have come from years of conditioning, I think that art is a very important place to start, because you get people's soft points, and you get to inject truths into them. You get to sort of force them to face truths that otherwise they wouldn't face. And I think sometimes that can happen in the process of planting a seed. You know, I think like getting people to engage with politics, and not necessarily I always think about there's two different kinds of artists. There's an artist who will give you the politics there straight on the plate, and I think that that's needed, and I think it's powerful and has a certain purpose. Though I think when you look at the people who gravitate towards that sort of art, they're already people who are politically engaged. They're already people who are somewhat on a level. You know, there's a similar wavelength. When you look at art that plays with nuance, that plays with the mundane, but uses imagination to inject politics within it, and sometimes that doesn't have to be purposeful. That can be simply because the artist themselves is educated on these topics and lives these concepts, and that they somehow permeate through the art. When that happens, I think it creates somewhat of a bigger space for relation, and that internal work, that planting that seed of that internal work can be done. That being said, I don't think it's the sole answer to the question, but I think it could be a start, a start of the dialogue.
Yeah, I agree, because there is some separation between what it means for an artist to use their imagination and the sort of reimagination that has to happen in our society. I don't think there should necessarily be a separation, but there is. One of the reasons it might be a separation is that one thing I think we all have to realize is that in a lot of ways, the ways our society is shaped is not by accident. And there are people, very brilliant people, whose job it is within certain think tanks going back decades to create the society that we're in now. So that imagination in some levels happening, and it's been happening already. I think that part of the answer for changing our world is to use imagination in a way that counters that, with organized think tanks representing changes we want to see as people, versus a lot of what has happened, which is changes based on who can afford to organize think tanks and enact the changes that reflect what they want to see in the world. Like a lot of policy is created by very smart people who are hired to figure out ways to engage in society the ideals and values of the people who can afford to do that. Now, us as people who aren't in those positions, who don't have those resources, we have to somehow figure out a way to tie our imaginations in to having real transformative change on society. And right now there seems to be a wide gulf between what we can do as artists where we are and the high level changes that have to happen before society is more reflective of what we actually want.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was thinking, in terms of vulnerability, in terms of like, let's say the engaging with art. Let's give the example of a live music event. I'm going to a show of one of my favorite artists. They're expressing something. There's this point of relation. There's this communication. There's this solace created. Do you feel, as someone who tours on a regular basis, who does this as their bread and butter, do you feel that change? Do you feel that change in that person, or do you sometimes feel that people aren't quite getting the point? How do you feel your work is received? Are you happy with how your work is received in, like, let's say, for example, a live music environment?
What I have learned that I have to accept after quite a few years of doing this, putting out a handful of projects and performing all over the world at this point, is that you can neither predict nor control how somebody's going to receive your work, even if they absolutely love it. You have no idea what it's going to mean for them. You have no idea how they're going to interpret it. And in some ways, I've had to learn to let go of that.
Yeah, I think this is still what wrecks my brain,
Because it can be totally. I have felt defeated at times by somebody telling me what one of my lyrics meant to them.
Yeah, that
was just so way off the mark. So like impossibly not what I like, couldn't have been further from what I meant, but it was how they took it and it meant something to them. And I don't want to crush whatever light that gave them.
Yeah.
But I do have an internal struggle at times of like I wish that there was a way to be more in control of how I am received, but I know, for sure at this point that there's just no way.
I also think that's my favorite kind of art to some extent, that like moving into the abstract idea, and people being able to pull their own sense of meaning from it. My problem is with that is my anxiety to some extent about my own work, and then like you said, it's like I can't have control over how things are being perceived, So yeah, I find that really interesting, and how maybe that how that plays into your like mental processes and journey as an artist,
I mean, I think that there was a time when I was trying to be very in tune with what I thought people would like about what I do or retain about, or what would resonate with them. And I started to kind of like just drive myself mad doing that, like trying to be in other people's heads and be in front of how they would receive things. And there's just no way. And I think it was costing me more than it was benefiting me to try to be so controlling of that, when really there's no way to control it. And honestly, you're lucky if anybody hears you. You're lucky if anybody retains anything. You're lucky if anything resonates with people. And that's not to say that if they take something the wrong way, you have to celebrate it or embrace it. But at the very least, you can't be too wrapped up in it. It just doesn't end up doing you any good.
Yeah.
On that point, we should point out that just a few days ago, we actually curated what we called a Rap Poetics seminar, where effectively we took the format of a seminar class from university, but we used that time to close read and analyze Otis's lyrics. And we did that with some academics, some PhD students, and some undergrad students at the university, with Otis present and having a dialogue about what that song revealed to us, and engaging with the idea, because the concept behind it was that this has much of a place in these structures as poetry, because if poetry is there on the basis of it being rich and deep and insightful and thoughtful and affecting, then hip hop should be there too. And I think for some context, the UK universities are way behind America in terms of its institutional embrace of hip hop. And I know it's definitely not perfect in America either, but in the UK it's lagging massively. So we're at that very early stage of trying to suggest that hip hop has a place in those classes. And it was really interesting to me how often our interpretations would read something into it that wasn't present from what Otis was saying, but nevertheless, to my mind, seemed to add to a very interesting conversation that enriched the experience of those who were there. And I mean, Otis, maybe you'd have a different sense of that. I suppose my question that comes from that: how important do you think that is to bring these sorts of these art forms, hip hop, into that space, to have that conversation, and I guess not prove, because I've been very careful not to frame this as proving anything. I think we should take for granted the fact that hip hop is as rich as this. But is it important and necessary to have this sort of conversation between different institutions? Just your thoughts on that.
I think it's extremely important, but also recognize the challenges of it, because hip hop is so much about space time. It's so much about where a person grew up, where they live, what's around them. Even though, I've spoken a lot about how it doesn't have to be bound to that. There's a lot of ways in which it's inextricable. Like, even if I'm using my imagination, it's still my imagination in context of someone who grew up in the 80s and 90s in Chicago and lives in LA and is a Black American, and all of the other experiences that I've had. They're always present. And so with people who have that shared experience with me, there's always a kind of shorthand. And it can be so difficult to explain to people outside of that context why something within it is important. And that is the overarching long-term conversation that has to happen between the artist and the academic, because hip hop is so much about context, so much about context. What ends up getting lost for me, and the reason why I do think it's extremely important, is because there's people who make very important hip hop that if it isn't reflected in terms of numbers of units sold, if it isn't celebrated by the business world, by the music industry, the important artists get lost to time. And that can mean so much, just in not even, I'm thinking specifically of what that means for like human beings that I feel like have made very important work that since it's not celebrated by the music industry, these people's lives get destroyed sometimes because they've put so much work into an art that didn't reward them in any way. And I think that academic institutions have a unique ability to preserve and to shine a light on and put in a proper context things that the business world didn't celebrate.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's, to me, is what creates the urgency for that conversation to continue.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. Do you think that you mentioned about hip hop needing so much context and in comparison to perhaps other art forms, do you think that that's just the fact that academia gives the privilege of time to these other art forms and doesn't give it to hip hop? Do you think actually realistic, like when you look at a piece of art, when you look at a specific poet that's studied in academia or whatever, do you think perhaps that, you know, it's simply the fact that they're willing to pay it more attention, pay it more time? Or do you think there is a tangible difference? Do you think yeah?
I mean, one tangible difference that pops into my mind, even just hearing you ask the question, is I think about how easy it is for other types of artists, whether this is visual, whether this is artists of language. It is easier, I think, in a lot of senses, to create something that you are specifically, your intention is to speak to that world. When you're writing certain types of poetry, when you're making certain types of visual art, that like even as pure of as an expression as it is, as the maker, you know you're creating it for that arena, and you know that it will be judged and it will be seen and it will be it'll be qualified, validated by that world. Where in hip hop, I don't think there's as much room to do that. I don't think in terms of hip hop, I think it's harder for you to make a song where you're like, I'm making this song knowing that is going to be played by, you know, people pressing a button in the Smithsonian with and I think it's harder to do. I don't know why that is exactly. But I just don't think that room in the art form exists in a way that still makes the product seem genuine. And I think that it would sound strange if somebody did that. It would sound pretentious if somebody did that. And hip hop just doesn't seem to have as much room for that sort of thing.
Really interesting. I mean, unfortunately, we have to look at wrapping up now. But yeah, that's really interesting. Lots more questions sort of develop from that. I suppose my final one, though, would be looking ahead to our next event, which is going to be around the concept of home. And I think whilst that's for next week, I think it could be particularly pertinent talking about your latest album, because that seemed to be a real meditation on not just home as a concept, but literally housing. And it speaks to a situation very similar in the UK recently, which was where, due to class and race structures, one of the inner city towers, basically caught fire, and tragically so many people died. But it was due to class and racist structures, and it really brings to light these questions about home and the complexity of home for those who are socially marginalized within the place that they literally live, they physically inhabit. And so I just would be really interested in your reflections on home, perhaps in terms of the album itself, but maybe more generally. So yeah, something on home.
I mean, to me, that's a difficult question to answer. And it's just me as an individual, because I don't have a place to point to and be like, I grew up there. That my life, my development, my upbringing was about a series of different apartments all over Chicago and in, you know, all over LA, and none of them exist now as like a place that my family has owned and I can say this is the room I grew up in. I don't have access to any of those spaces. So like in a lot of ways I feel displaced and kind of have always felt displaced, and that has made me have to engage the concept of home more in a sense of making wherever I am at a particular time feel like home. But that speaks to the kind of conditions that can result in the erasure that album came from, and sounds like kind of what you're speaking to in the situation you just described.
Otis, do you want a final thought on that, maybe leading into the event next week?
Yeah, sure. So I guess in many ways I have a similar feeling, that a feeling of foreignness, and we spoke a bit about it in the book launch, a feeling of foreignness, a feeling of being displaced. But I think for me that stems less from not having a physical house in one place, because I had a physical house where I went to every day, and to some extent of, you know, it's like a very traditional bringing in that sense, like roof over my head, food in the fridge, privileged position there. I think for me, the feeling of being displaced came from being othered so much, you know, going into school and being othered, walking into different areas in Sheffield and being othered. You start to sort of feel like I guess it brings into the bigger concept of Britishness and what it means to be British. You start to feel when you get asked the question, where are you from? And then, no, but where are you really from? When that is sort of circulated so many times, you start to feel like, oh, you know, perhaps this place actually isn't my home. You start to feel like a philosophical nomad of sorts, you know? So for me, I think that impacted my sense of home, but also, I guess, get again back to sort of trying to my mind working overtime and maybe injecting the political into something. I'm thinking about how I don't want to, I want to make a conscious decision not to attach myself to a specific piece of land and call it my home. I'm aware of patriotism being a political war for evil, a political tool for evil in many ways, and for colonization. So for me, I'm making a conscious decision to say, actually, yeah, Sheffield is my home. The UK is my home because my continued experience of home is constantly created here, being that my mum lives here, being that my dad lives here, being that, you know, my favorite, I don't know, let's say like Theatre Delhi put on a great play every 2 weeks. The fact that that happens constantly curates my identity and experience of home. Though once you start to pluck those things away, I have no real attachment to the environment itself. It just starts to look like a lifeless piece of geography, you know? So then it becomes again, me injecting the political into it and thinking, is this really my home? Or am I just, I guess, thinking about it metaphysically and our continued curation of reality? Is it really real, or is it just a constant injection of new senses and sort of new stimuli? And I guess that's the way I'm seeing home, and I think to some extent that's acting as a buffer for the otherness. You know, it's sort of acting as a protective shield, because I can say, well, you know, it was never really my home anyway. My family are my home. My favorite hip hop artists are my home, and that's, if you look at my sort of my way of thinking and the way it's developed through my journey as an artist, I always just, I felt this foreignness. I felt like a foreign object. So I looked into hip hop, and the way my mind worked is I just delved into this one thing. Like I put the tunnel vision on and delved into it, and I became that one thing, if you will, you know? So I guess that's the way my mind works, and it's protecting me from to some extent trauma, you know?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And next Monday, when we get into the conversation around home, we'll explore all of those ideas and more, because I think there's so much to pick up on there, a lot of big topics and themes. As for this one, as for Rap Poetics, I think we have to draw the discussion to a close. Thank you so much for your insights on so many things, both hip hop and beyond. Before we go, though, it wouldn't be a hip hop event, I don't think, without a semblance of performance. So if Open Mic and Otis, you're happy to proceed,
Yeah, sure.
then that would be great to watch you perform anything that you'd like.
I'll perform a piece a cappella from the EP Rap Poetics, and then I'll let Open Mic close with some music. So this one's called Under the Bed, and it's about anxiety induced by society, I guess, to an extent. This little bit of buzz is serendipitous. Burnt out, rising, shining, falling out the sky like Icarus. Building bridges up and then jump from cognitive dissonance. The rigor defined on the ledge where the preacher meets the physicist. Oh yeah, where Nietzsche meets the burning bush. A gust of wind from the lungs of a psalmist with a surly grunt. A merciless puff on the cusp of discerning love. We gathered lit from crunk, but how's that help I plight when I do what a video vixen does? And dance the night away for pleasure or aesthetic. Shine like full moon phases, fugazi and fetishize my perish. When my light decays, scribe my story in debris, indelible hysterics. Chart from Armageddon, stuck in states of sunk sedate in essence. Rap poetics like calisthenics, zealous champion pages of esoteric pyrotechnics, but this life is Tetris. And it keeps piling on me. Pilot of crash, pride a zombie, revived to a life of longing. Scribe like Murakami, a linguist, murals of one's dreams. Refer to me as plural, can't quantify me as one thing. Quantum leaps from concrete. Weary existence, teary admission of the truth. Leery and livid, eyes and ears hidden from the news. I'm hiding under the bed. Revelations under the bed. How I'm the monster under the bed that I was hiding from all along. I share my personality with a blacksmith who sharpened a blunt, a blade that I've fallen on. Fighting the sordid one, absorbing songs. It's all a ruse and con and Comic-Con when you don't belong in this world of wrong. Rhyme schemes like show to come with panoramic span. A cog in the machine, hip-hop reigns supreme over lands of man. Pulling back pieces from Pangea. Uniting and uplifting from Thailand to Tanzania, combating rampant fear with beats and breaks. Tell Sir Richard Branson, please no Brandon here. Piles of indigenous elders buried under this IKEA. So while you eat meatballs and toast to deforestation, the world is burning and my moral shaking, pristine like Aztec civilization, but still might eat your face off. The barbarian, rap contrarian, barbarian, flow aquarium, elephant in a cage and terrarium. You bought a harlequin and it ain't martyrdom, you cowardice and scarcely kin. How do I fight for a world I'm barely in? Theater of the absurd, they're killing kings with gusts of wind, you Philistine with motives full of sin. The end is imminent and they wipe you out of history unless you're looking Aryan. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Thank you, Open Mic, for joining us. Thank you, man.
All right, I'm gonna try to follow that. That was pretty incredible, man.
No, thank you, man.
All right, here we go. 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2, yeah. Might not want to hear, but the truth hurt. My pot belly getting big, need some new shirts. Everything ain't great, but I can do worse. Cause I can go to the dentist with my tooth hurt. I don't watch Blue Earth when I get stoned. To pull apart an ink pen like a wishbone. You just spend hella time in the friend zone. Loincloth and a tie like a Flintstone. Big afro wig with a chin strap. I'm thinking real hard, chewing on a pen cap. And some songs just more for the headphones. Fuck the NFL, fuck the red zone. It's about time people get set straight. They got my stomach upset, KO Pactate. And I was up all night, went to bed late. I had a big fat frame, black headache. And cut the dead weight off, get a new start. You can sell hot dogs to the fruit cart. And make your verse too long, make it 2 parts. I had a real bad dream, Bob Newhart. And I woke up crying in the bed, y'all. My lady asked him, I could have said hell no. But then I felt all bad for my weird mood. I looked up and my sky still clear blue. Big afro wig with a chin strap. I'm thinking real hard, chewing on a pen cap. And some songs just more for the headphones. Fuck the NFL, fuck the red zone. Yeah, it can all go away. All go away, just shut your eyes. It can all go away. It can all go away, just shut your eyes. It can all go away. It can all go away, just shut your eyes. It can all go away. It can all go away, just shut your eyes. It can all go away. It can all go away, just shut your eyes. It can all go away. It can all go away. Why is everything so miscellaneous? Get some messed up thoughts come instantaneous. And rap is dangerous, it's Hasselmania. I murdered Dracula in Castlevania, and the sun comes up and I need it. Vampires don't fuck with my genius. Mispronounce that though, I'm in genius. Don't let them see you ride your own thing. Check the censorship, extra strength for them extra sensitive people like me. She at them Triforce pieces I need. I won't buy till I see some idea. Okay, what's your largest sofa? Can I put one arm in Barcelona? Stretch all the way to Arizona. If not, fuck that, party's over. Sorry, Boma. Fine, Vegeta. Bye, Rihanna. Hi, Felicia. Hide all your weed inside the speaker. Bye, bye, police. It was nice to meet you. Yeah. It can all go away. It can all go away. Just shut your eyes. It can all go away. It can all go away. Just shut your eyes. It can all go away. It can all go away. Just shut your eyes. It can all go away. It can all go away. Just shut your eyes. It can all go away. It can all go away, just shut your eyes. It can all go away. It can all go away, yeah. Thanks for making that space for me, y'all.
Man, thank you so much. I love that song so much. I was trying hard not to sing the words.
Oh, that would be ill.
Oh man, yeah. Thank you so much for your time and your resources, and again for your art. It truly was transformative for me, and I'm certain for so many other people. So, and thank you for existing, man.
I'm grateful to have made that sort of impact for you.
Definitely,
man.
Thank
you for saying it, and thank you for everything you're doing in terms of elevating the art form. We appreciate it a lot.
Much love, man. Alex, thank you for facilitating.
Nice to meet you, brother. Thank you.
You too.
Yeah, cool. I hope you guys, I guess for your open mic, having a blessed rest of day. We're gonna get some sleep.
Thanks for doing this late night for sure. Thank you.
No, it's all right. Cool. I'll see you guys soon. Peace and love.
Peace.
Catch you later.